The beef pack system, so called because it's used to construct the relatively long single wire fences typically used by beef farmers. The beef pack system has several fundamental advantages over more traditional temporary fencing methods. Firstly, it divides into two distinct parts. The first part is the beef pack itself, which is essentially a geared winder attached to a rack for carrying the tread-ins. The second part is the fence itself. One fundamental advantage of the spider pack system is that its spools are detachable from the winding apparatus, which means that you only have to have one beef pack for as many fences as you require on the farm. The other major advantage of the beef pack system is that, as with the dairy pack, you can carry all the equipment you need for an individual fence, which means that to erect or dismantle a fence, you only have to go down the fence line once. Your first purchase with a beef pack system will probably be a beef pack starter kit, which divides into two major subkits. We have the beef pack kit and the beef pack fence kit. The fence kit provides enough material for a 300-metre fence, or freestanding fence, on average terrain. It consists of a spool wound with 300 metres of polywire and a spare release hook, a cattle tread-in kit, which contains 12 standard cattle tread-ins in kit set form, and a cattle end assembly tread-in kit, which gives you 6 further standard tread-ins, plus all the gear you need to construct 2 cattle end assemblies. Let's have a look at the beef pack kit, starting with the rack. Here we have the rack itself, the rack handle, which attaches here using a collet to lock it on. We also have the rack clamp, which is used to secure the tread-ins in the rack. Onto the parts of the single geared winder. The single geared winder has a gearbox which has a crankshaft, a spindle and 2 docking boxes. The winder also has a crank, a spindle lock which locks the spindle, a crank locking disc, a chuck which mounts on the spindle and onto which we mount the spools, a guide for tracking the polywire onto the spool, and a chassis for connecting the single geared winder to the rack. Let's assemble the single geared winder. The first step is to pop the spindle lock onto the crankshaft. Make sure it's on the right way so that it locks onto the 2 flat pieces at the end of the spindle. Next, insert the crank into the crankshaft, and supporting this end of the crankshaft on a wooden buffer, tap the crank in. We're going to pop the crank locking disc into this groove here, so we need to make sure that there's enough room for it, which there is. So we take the crank locking disc and pop it on. We can give it a spin just to make sure that it's properly in place. Next, we take the chuck and we're going to secure it onto the spindle by driving it into place using a soft hammer or a piece of wood. Make sure you strike squarely on the end and never use a hard hammer on plastic parts. We're going to look for about 1 millimetre of clearance between the end of the chuck and the gearbox, so that just needs to go on a little further. There's a white cross marked on the bottom on the end of the guide, which aligns with the white cross on the gearbox. Place it in, rest the scalloped edge of the gearbox on the wooden buffer, and tap the guide home. If the guide comes to the end of the docking box, it's in far enough. Finally, we need to drive the chassis into this other docking box, and in this case we really can't go wrong. Once again, resting the scalloped edge on our wooden buffer and driving the chassis firmly into position. Again, we're looking for the end of the chassis to be at the end of the docking box. Right, we'll put the rack together, pop the collet onto where we attach the handle, screw the handle in so that it's in that more upright position, and once again we can tap it home with a wooden hammer. Take the rack clamp, and what we need to do is sight carefully through the hole and align the pin with the holes in the rack. And initially we can get it started by pressing it, turn it over and tap the pin through. Alternatively, we could have used a pair of vice grips to squeeze the pin into position. Finally, we just need to snap the winder onto the rack, like so. Note that the handle on the rack and the crank handle are on opposite sides. If we want to detach the winder, we just press the steel strip with our thumb or finger and detach. That's the beef pack.